The story does not begin with a triumphant crowd or a raised arm. It begins in silence, on a cold morning after the First World War, in a defeated nation searching for someone to blame, and in the mind of an obscure, angry man who had failed at almost everything he had tried. In 1933, when Adolf Hitler stood at the window of the Reich Chancellery and watched torchlight processions flood the streets of Berlin, few could believe that this former, homeless drifter, rejected artist, and political nobody had become the leader of Germany. The question that echoes through history is not only how he rose to power, but why millions followed him. Adolf Hitler was born in 1889 in the Austro-Hungarian town of Braunau am Inn, a borderland that would later shape his obsession with German identity. His childhood was marked by conflict, authority, and instability. His father was domineering, his ambitions rigid. His mother was loving, then tragically lost to illness. These early experiences planted in Hitler a deep resentment toward authority he could not control, and a hunger for recognition he never received. When he failed to gain admission to the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts, the rejection shattered his self-image. It was not merely disappointment, it was humiliation. From this point forward, Hitler began to reinterpret his failures not as personal shortcomings, but as conspiracies and injustices inflicted by others. Vienna exposed him to radical nationalism, anti-Semitic ideology, and mass politics. Living in poverty, he absorbed ideas that framed the world as a struggle between races, nations, and wills. These beliefs did not yet make him powerful, but they gave him something dangerous, a sense of purpose forged from grievance. When World War I broke out, Hitler volunteered eagerly. For the first time, he felt belonging. The army gave him structure, discipline, and meaning. Germany's defeat in 1918, therefore, did not feel like a military loss to him. It felt like betrayal. The collapse of the empire, the abdication of the Kaiser, and the signing of the Treaty of Versailles became in Hitler's mind proof that internal enemies had stabbed the nation in the back. Post-war Germany was fertile ground for extremism. The Weimar Republic was born in chaos, economic collapse, political violence, and national humiliation. Hyperinflation wiped out savings overnight. Veterans returned to unemployment and despair. Parliamentary democracy seemed weak and indecisive. In this environment, Hitler joined a small fringe group in Munich, the German Workers' Party. He was not remarkable at first, except when he spoke. His speeches transformed personal rage into collective anger. He did not argue, he accused. He did not analyze, he promised. Crowds responded not because he offered solutions, but because he offered certainty. By 1921, Hitler had seized control of the party, renaming it the National Socialist German Workers' Party. He crafted a new political weapon, propaganda fused with myth. He portrayed Germany as a victim, himself as its voice, and enemies, real and imagined, as the cause of all suffering. In 1923, emboldened by Mussolini's march on Rome, Hitler attempted to seize power in the beer hall putsch. It failed disastrously. He was arrested and sentenced to prison. Many believed his political career was over. Instead, prison became a turning point. During his confinement, Hitler wrote Mein Kampf, a manifesto of ideology, hatred, and ambition. More importantly, he learned a crucial lesson. Power in modern Germany would not be taken by force. It would be taken through the system itself. When he was released, he rebuilt the Nazi Party not as a street movement alone, but as a national machine. He cultivated loyalty, demanded absolute obedience, and shaped the party around his personality. Hitler's psychological strength lay not in flexibility, but in unwavering belief in his own destiny. Doubt, once eliminated from his own mind, could not exist in those around him. The Great Depression changed everything. By 1930, millions of Germans were unemployed. Desperation returned with a vengeance. Hitler's message evolved from rage to rescue. He promised jobs, stability, pride, and revival. Each election brought more Nazi seats in the Reichstag. Conservative elites, industrialists, and political insiders despised Hitler, but they believed they could use him. They underestimated him fatally. In January 1933, after backroom deals and miscalculations, President Paul von Hindenburg appointed Adolf Hitler Chancellor of Germany. What followed was not a sudden dictatorship, but a calculated dismantling of democracy. The Reichstag fire, only weeks later, became the pretext to suspend civil liberties. Fear replaced freedom. Opponents were arrested, silenced, or driven underground. Through the enabling act, Hitler gained the power to rule by decree. Each step was justified as temporary, necessary, legal. Each step made the next inevitable. The machinery of the state was turned into an instrument of control. Psychologically, Hitler thrived on crisis. He framed himself as Germany's last defense against chaos. Loyalty was rewarded, hesitation was punished. Betrayal, real or imagined, was met with brutality, as seen in the Night of the Long Knives. By eliminating rivals within his own movement, Hitler secured absolute authority. The Führer myth was complete. He was no longer a politician. He was destiny, embodied. The consequences were catastrophic. Policies born from ideology and obsession led to rearmament, persecution, war, and genocide. What began as promises of renewal became engines of suffering on an industrial scale. Millions would die because one man's grievances were amplified by a nation's despair and enabled by institutions that failed to stop him. Hitler's rise to power is not merely a German story. It is a warning written in blood and memory. It shows how fear can overpower reason, how failure can breed fanaticism, and how democracy can collapse not with a single blow, but with applause. When societies seek saviors instead of solutions, when anger becomes identity, and when truth is sacrificed for comfort, the path from failure to tyranny becomes dangerously short. History does not whisper this lesson, it screams it. The silence that follows is ours to break. Personal failure did not merely influence Adolf Hitler's worldview, it forged it. Long before he commanded armies or mesmerized crowds, Hitler experienced a series of rejections that cut deeply into his sense of identity and worth. These failures did not humble him or inspire self-reflection. Instead, they hardened him. They became the emotional fuel that transformed disappointment into bitterness, and bitterness into a dangerous ideology rooted in grievance, blame, and ambition. To understand Hitler's rise, one must begin not with politics, but with psychology, because the man who later promised national salvation was first consumed by a personal sense of defeat. Hitler's early life offered little stability. Born in 1889, he grew up under the shadow of a strict, authoritarian father who valued obedience and practicality, and who dismissed Adolf's artistic dreams as useless fantasies. This constant tension created a young man who resented authority while simultaneously craving dominance. His mother, the emotional center of his life, offered warmth and reassurance, but her death left him unanchored. The loss deepened his emotional isolation and reinforced a belief that the world was cruel, unjust, and personally hostile. Even before adulthood, Hitler had begun to see suffering not as a shared human condition, but as a personal injustice inflicted upon him. The defining blow came in Vienna. Hitler believed himself destined to become a great artist, convinced that recognition would validate his sense of superiority and purpose. Twice he applied to the Academy of Fine Arts, and twice he was rejected. For most people, such rejection might inspire growth, adjustment, or a painful reassessment of talent. For Hitler, it was unbearable. He could not accept the idea that he lacked ability. Instead, he externalized blame. The failure was not his. It was the fault of a corrupt system, biased gatekeepers, and shadowy forces conspiring against him. This psychological pattern, refusing responsibility and projecting blame outward, would later define his political thinking. Vienna also exposed Hitler to a toxic intellectual environment, where radical nationalism, racial theories, and anti-Semitic propaganda circulated openly. Living in poverty, drifting between hostels and streets, Hitler absorbed these ideas not as abstract theories, but as explanations for his own misery. Ideology gave his failure meaning. It told him that he was not weak or untalented, but wronged, that his suffering was evidence of a larger conspiracy against people like him. This belief was seductive. It transformed personal inadequacy into moral outrage, and provided enemies to hate rather than flaws to confront. World War I temporarily rescued Hitler from insignificance. The uniform gave him identity. The battlefield gave him belonging. For the first time, he felt part of something larger than himself. Yet even here, the seeds of extremism deepened. Hitler did not rise through the ranks. He remained a corporal, obedient, isolated, and socially awkward. But the war validated his belief in struggle, sacrifice, and domination. When Germany surrendered in 1918, the shock was profound. The defeat shattered not only the nation, but Hitler's fragile sense of purpose. Once again, he interpreted loss not as the outcome of complex realities, but as betrayal. The idea that Germany had been stabbed in the back by internal enemies mirrored the way he had long interpreted his own life. Success denied by others, greatness sabotaged by traitors. From this point forward, Hitler's personal grievances fused with political resentment. His failures were no longer individual, they were national. His wounded ego found refuge in collective anger. This psychological merger is critical. Hitler did not simply manipulate public frustration, he shared it, embodied it, and magnified it. When he spoke, his words carried emotional authenticity because they were born from lived resentment. He did not perform rage, he believed it. This is why his speeches resonated so powerfully with millions who felt humiliated by defeat, impoverished by inflation, and ignored by elites. Hitler's personal narrative mirrored Germany's post-war trauma, and he instinctively positioned himself as proof that humiliation could be transformed into power. Crucially, Hitler never processed failure in a healthy or reflective way. He did not learn resilience or empathy from suffering. Instead, failure convinced him that mercy was weakness, compromise was betrayal, and domination was justice. These beliefs shaped his leadership style. He demanded absolute loyalty because he feared abandonment. He crushed dissent because disagreement reminded him of rejection. He clung to rigid ideology because flexibility would require admitting error. In his mind, to question himself was to relive humiliation, and that was intolerable. As Hitler gained followers, his unresolved failures became strengths in the political arena. His inability to doubt himself made him appear decisive. His refusal to accept blame made him a master of scapegoating. His obsession with destiny and greatness compensated for years of insignificance. But this transformation came at a terrible cost. A man who could not forgive his own failures could never forgive others. Policies born from resentment led to persecution. Decisions driven by wounded pride led to catastrophic risk-taking. The same psychological traits that propelled Hitler upward eventually dragged the world into devastation. Hitler's rise demonstrates a terrifying truth. Personal failure, when filtered through ego, fear, and ideology, can become a force of mass destruction. His story warns that unexamined humiliation can metastasize into hatred, and that leaders who cannot confront their own weaknesses will seek enemies instead. When failure is denied rather than understood, it does not disappear, it grows more dangerous. History remembers Adolf Hitler not only as a dictator, but as a man who allowed his personal defeats to define his destiny, and in doing so reshaped the fate of millions. Germany's collapse after the First World War created more than economic hardship. It produced a psychological wound that cut through every layer of society. Defeat did not merely end a war. It shattered a national identity built on pride, militarism, and belief in destiny. When the armistice was signed in November 1918, Germany did not feel conquered on the battlefield. It felt humiliated at the negotiating table. This sense of dishonor became the emotional soil in which extremist ideology took root. And without this environment, Adolf Hitler's rise would have been impossible. The Treaty of Versailles formalized Germany's humiliation in ways that felt deliberately punitive. The nation was forced to accept full responsibility for the war, a clause that struck at its moral legitimacy. Vast territories were lost, the military was crippled, and crushing reparations were imposed. For ordinary Germans, this was not abstract diplomacy, it was lived reality. Former soldiers returned to a country that no longer honored them. Families struggled to feed themselves, savings vanished, national pride dissolved into bitterness. The treaty became more than a document, it became a symbol of collective shame. The Weimar Republic, born from this defeat, inherited a broken nation. Though democratic in structure, it was fragile in spirit. Many Germans associated democracy not with freedom, but with surrender. Parliamentary debates felt detached from suffering. Coalition governments collapsed one after another, reinforcing the belief that democracy was weak, chaotic, and incapable of decisive action. Street violence became common as political factions fought openly for influence. Extremism thrived not because Germans were naturally radical, but because moderation seemed powerless. Economic disaster soon deepened the crisis. Hyperinflation in the early 1920s destroyed the middle class almost overnight. Lifelong savings became worthless paper. Professionals, shopkeepers, and pensioners watched their security evaporate while speculators and opportunists survived. Trust in institutions collapsed. Money itself lost meaning, and with it, faith in the system that issued it. In such conditions, anger no longer needed instruction. It was instinctive. People did not ask who had caused their suffering. They demanded someone to blame. This atmosphere was fertile ground for radical narratives. Extremist movements offered something democracy could not: certainty. They simplified complexity into enemies and promises. Adolf Hitler did not invent Germany's despair. He translated it. He framed economic misery as deliberate sabotage, national humiliation as betrayal, and political weakness as treason. His message resonated because it echoed what millions already felt, but could not articulate. He spoke to wounded pride, not reason. To a population exhausted by uncertainty, his absolutes felt comforting. The Great Depression delivered the final blow. When global markets collapsed in 1929, Germany was uniquely vulnerable due to its dependence on foreign loans. Unemployment soared into the millions. Breadlines stretched through city streets. Hope, already fragile, collapsed entirely. Desperation does not produce careful judgment, it produces urgency. In this climate, extremist parties surged. The Nazis promised work, order, and restored honor. They did not need to explain how. Belief mattered more than detail. What made Hitler especially dangerous was his ability to fuse national suffering with personal destiny. He did not present himself as a politician negotiating solutions, but as a figure of historical necessity. He claimed to embody Germany's will, its pain, and its future. Each rally transformed economic anxiety into emotional release. Each speech turned humiliation into defiance. The suffering of the people became proof that his message was true. The worse conditions became, the more credible he appeared. Importantly, Hitler's rise was not driven solely by the poor or desperate. Industrialists feared communism, conservatives feared social collapse, elites feared losing control. Many believed they could harness Hitler's popularity without surrendering power to him. This miscalculation was born from the same instability that empowered him. When institutions weaken, confidence replaces caution. Extremism is often invited in the hope that it can be controlled. History shows it cannot. Germany's post-war crisis did not remove moral choice, but it narrowed perceived options. In times of stability, radical ideology appears dangerous. In times of despair, it appears decisive. Hitler's genius, if it can be called that, was his instinctive understanding of this shift. He did not need to persuade Germany to abandon democracy. Germany was already losing faith in it. He simply offered a narrative that made suffering feel meaningful and revenge feel righteous. The tragedy is that economic pain and national humiliation do not inevitably lead to tyranny. They become dangerous when combined with leaders who exploit fear rather than heal it, and societies that accept simple answers to complex problems. Germany's suffering was real. Its anger was understandable. But when pain is weaponized instead of addressed, it becomes a tool of destruction. Hitler's rise reminds us that extremist ideology rarely begins at the margins during times of collapse. It moves toward the center, carried by desperation and legitimized by fear. When nations are stripped of dignity and stability, they become vulnerable not only to enemies abroad, but to saviors at home. The lesson is not about Germany alone. It is a warning about what happens when economic collapse erodes trust, when humiliation replaces hope, and when people are driven to believe that only absolute power can rescue them from chaos. Adolf Hitler's rise cannot be understood without confronting the central weapon he wielded with chilling precision: propaganda. He did not merely communicate ideas, he engineered belief. In an age of mass politics, radio, rallies, newspapers, and symbols became tools more powerful than armies, and Hitler grasped this earlier and more intuitively than almost anyone else. His mastery of propaganda transformed private resentment into public loyalty, individual frustration into collective identity, and political messages into emotional experiences. What made this mastery so dangerous was not sophistication of facts, but simplicity of feeling. Hitler understood something fundamental about human psychology. People do not move as masses because they are convinced. They move because they feel seen, threatened, and promised meaning. His speeches were not lectures. They were performances designed to bypass reason and strike emotion. He began slowly, almost hesitantly, allowing tension to build. Then his voice hardened, his gestures sharpened, and his words turned accusatory. He named enemies. He described humiliation. He promised restoration. By the end, listeners did not feel informed. They felt awakened. For many, it was the first time someone had spoken their anger aloud. Central to this propaganda was the creation of a simple narrative in a complex world. Germany's problems were not presented as the result of global economics, military defeat, or political instability. They were framed as the work of identifiable enemies, traitors within, conspirators without. This reduction of complexity was essential. It allowed suffering to have a cause and anger to have a target. Once people accepted this framework, logic became irrelevant. Evidence that contradicted the narrative was dismissed as deception. Truth was no longer what could be proven, it was what felt right. Hitler also understood the power of repetition. A lie, repeated often enough and loudly enough, begins to feel familiar. Familiarity breeds acceptance. Acceptance hardens into belief. Nazi propaganda did not rely on constant novelty. It relied on relentless consistency. The same themes echoed everywhere. Germany humiliated, enemies corrupt, Hitler resolute. Over time, these messages shaped perception itself. People did not merely hear propaganda, they began to think through it. Equally important was the visual language of the Nazi movement. Uniforms, flags, symbols, and carefully choreographed rallies created a sense of order and belonging. In a society traumatized by chaos, this visual discipline was deeply reassuring. The individual disappeared into the mass, and the mass felt powerful. Torchlight processions, banners stretching endlessly into the distance, and synchronized chants transformed politics into ritual. These events did not argue for loyalty, they generated it emotionally. To attend was to feel part of something larger, something inevitable. Hitler's image was carefully crafted as well. He was portrayed not as an ordinary politician, but as a figure of destiny. Photographs showed him thoughtful, resolute, distant. Films presented him as calm amid chaos, decisive amid doubt. Propaganda emphasized his personal sacrifices, his alleged humility, his supposed unity with the people. This constructed myth blurred the line between man and nation. To criticize Hitler became, psychologically, to criticize Germany itself. The role of Joseph Goebbels, the regime's chief propagandist, was crucial, but it was Hitler who set the emotional tone. Goebbels refined the methods, but Hitler supplied the raw conviction. Propaganda worked because it aligned with Hitler's own beliefs. He was not cynically manipulating ideas he secretly doubted. He was amplifying obsessions he fully embraced. This authenticity made his message more persuasive. Followers sensed belief, not performance. Crucially, Nazi propaganda did not rely solely on persuasion. It relied on isolation, independent. Newspapers were shut down or absorbed. Dissenting voices were silenced. Over time, Germans were surrounded by a single narrative reinforced from every direction. When alternative perspectives disappear, even extreme ideas begin to feel normal. Fear also played its role. People learned quickly that disagreement carried consequences. Silence became survival, and silence allowed propaganda to operate without challenge. The effectiveness of Hitler's propaganda can be measured by its results. Ordinary citizens accepted the erosion of freedoms. Neighbors turned against neighbors. Persecution was reframed as necessity. War was framed as destiny. Each step seemed justified because it fit the narrative already accepted. Propaganda did not force people to abandon morality overnight. It gradually redefined morality itself. What once seemed unthinkable became acceptable, then righteous. Perhaps most disturbing is how willingly many participated. Propaganda did not only deceive, it offered emotional rewards. It gave people pride, belonging, and a sense of superiority. It transformed fear into confidence and resentment into purpose. For individuals who had felt powerless, this was intoxicating. Loyalty to Hitler became loyalty to a new self-image, strong, chosen, and justified. Hitler's mastery of propaganda reveals a profound danger in modern societies. When communication technologies amplify emotion faster than reason, and when leaders frame identity around grievance, truth becomes vulnerable. Propaganda does not need to eliminate facts. It needs only to drown them in feeling. Once people believe that their pain proves their righteousness, persuasion becomes unnecessary. This chapter of history stands as a warning that mass loyalty can be manufactured, that hatred can be normalized, and that reality itself can be reshaped when fear and pride are skillfully manipulated. Hitler's rise was not powered by truth but by narrative, not by debate but by emotion, and when emotion replaces reason as the engine of politics, the consequences can be catastrophic.
Adolf Hitler did not seize power in Germany through a dramatic overthrow or a sudden military coup. His ascent was far more unsettling because it was legal, gradual, and cloaked in legitimacy. The very institutions designed to protect democracy became the pathways through which it was dismantled. This slow erosion of democratic norms, enabled by political miscalculation and public exhaustion, stands as one of the most chilling lessons of modern history. Tyranny does not always arrive by force.
Sometimes it is invited in, step by step. After the chaos of World War I, the Weimar Republic was established as Germany's first democracy. On paper, it was progressive, granting civil liberties, universal suffrage, and parliamentary governance. In reality, it was fragile. Coalition governments were unstable, presidents ruled frequently by emergency decree, and public confidence in democratic processes steadily eroded. Elections became frequent, but ineffective, producing paralysis rather than progress. For many Germans, democracy began to feel less like representation and more like dysfunction. Hitler recognized this weakness and adapted his strategy accordingly. After the failed beer hall putsch in 1923, he understood that violent revolution would not succeed in Germany. Prison did not moderate his ambitions, it refined them. He concluded that power must be captured from within the system. From that point on, the Nazi Party publicly committed itself to legality, elections, and constitutional methods. This shift reassured voters, disarmed opponents, and allowed Hitler to present himself not as a revolutionary threat, but as a lawful alternative to chaos. As economic crises deepened, Nazi electoral support grew. By 1932, the party had become the largest in the Reichstag, though still without an outright majority. Crucially, Hitler did not win power because most Germans voted for dictatorship. He won because no stable government could be formed without him. Conservative politicians, military leaders, and industrial elites feared communism more than fascism. They despised Hitler's radicalism, but believed they could control him. This was the fatal illusion. President Paul von Hindenburg, an aging war hero, initially resisted Hitler. But repeated government failures, political pressure, and elite lobbying wore him down. In January 1933, Hitler was appointed chancellor, not dictator, at the head of a coalition government. Only a few Nazis held cabinet positions. Many believed this appointment would tame him, bind him to constitutional limits, and expose his incompetence. Instead, it handed him the authority he needed. Once in office, Hitler moved with ruthless speed, exploiting every legal tool available. The Reichstag fire in February 1933 became the turning point. Whether or not the Nazis orchestrated it, Hitler used the event to declare a national emergency. With Hindenburg's approval, civil liberties were suspended. Freedom of speech, press, and assembly vanished overnight. Arrests followed, communists first, then social democrats, then anyone deemed a threat. All of this was done under emergency laws that already existed within the Constitution. Elections were held again in March 1933, but they were neither free nor fair. Opposition parties were intimidated, their leaders imprisoned or silenced. Even so, the Nazis failed to secure a full majority. What followed was the most decisive legal act in Hitler's rise, the Enabling Act. Presented as a temporary measure to restore stability, it allowed the cabinet, effectively Hitler, to pass laws without parliamentary approval. Under pressure, fear, and the presence of armed guards in the Reichstag, the act passed. Democracy voted itself out of existence. From this moment on, Hitler's power was absolute, yet still cloaked in legality. Political parties were banned one by one. Trade unions were dissolved. Federal states lost autonomy. Courts were brought into line. Each move followed a law, a decree, or a regulation. There was no single moment when Germany fell. Instead, it slipped. Many Germans adjusted rather than resisted. Life seemed to stabilize. Jobs returned through rearmament and public works. Order replaced chaos. For those not targeted, the loss of freedom felt abstract compared to the return of security. This gradual normalization of authoritarianism was essential. By the time the full nature of the regime became clear, resistance was dangerous and isolated. Institutions that might have opposed Hitler, the judiciary, the military, the civil service, had already pledged loyalty. Oaths were transferred from the Constitution to the Führer personally. The state became an extension of one man's will, not through a sudden rupture, but through continuous accommodation. What makes this story so unsettling is how ordinary it appeared at the time. There were no tanks in the streets when Hitler was appointed chancellor, no immediate mass executions, no declaration of dictatorship. Instead, there were meetings, votes, laws, and compromises. Each step seemed justifiable in isolation. Together, they formed a trap from which there was no escape. Hitler's rise exposes a critical vulnerability in democratic systems. They depend not only on laws, but on norms, restraint, and good faith. When political actors abandon these principles in pursuit of short-term advantage, democracy becomes defenseless against those who exploit it. The elites who believed they could use Hitler underestimated his resolve and overestimated their control. By the time they realized their mistake, they were powerless. This chapter of history offers a stark warning. Democracy does not die only when overthrown by force. It can be eroded by fear, weakened by division, and surrendered through complacency. Hitler did not destroy German democracy alone. He was enabled by institutions that failed to protect themselves and by leaders who chose expediency over prink. Eipol. The lesson is timeless and unsettling. The most dangerous tyrants are not always those who reject the system openly, but those who learn how to use it better than anyone else. When legality replaces morality, when stability is valued more than freedom, and when power is granted in the hope of control, history shows how easily a society can trade its future for the illusion of order. The rise of Adolf Hitler ultimately stands as one of history's most devastating warnings about power, ideology, and human nature. It reveals how destructive forces are not born solely from cruelty, but from fear, wounded pride, and the human desire for certainty in times of chaos. Hitler did not impose his worldview on an unwilling nation by force alone. He rose because millions were prepared, emotionally, psychologically, and socially, to accept it. This is what makes the lesson universal and enduring. The danger does not lie only in one man, but in the conditions that allow such a man to be embraced. At the heart of Hitler's ascent was the promise of meaning. Germany in the interwar years was a nation stripped of identity. Defeat in war, economic collapse, and political instability had shattered confidence in institutions, leaders, and even neighbors. In such moments, people do not merely seek solutions, they seek explanations that restore dignity. Hitler offered exactly that. He told Germans that their suffering was not meaningless, not accidental, and not their fault. It was the result of betrayal. This narrative transformed pain into purpose, and humiliation into moral superiority. Once suffering becomes proof of righteousness, ideology becomes immune to doubt. This pattern is not unique to Nazi Germany. History repeatedly shows that when societies experience prolonged fear and instability, the appeal of absolute answers grows. Complexity feels exhausting. Compromise feels weak. Democracy, with its debates and delays, feels inadequate in the face of crisis. Hitler's success lay in his ability to present himself as the end of uncertainty. He did not promise peace of mind through understanding, but through obedience. He offered clarity by dividing the world into allies and enemies, strength and weakness, purity and corruption. For many, this simplicity felt like relief. Power, once concentrated, reshaped morality itself. Under Hitler, cruelty was reframed as necessity, and violence as duty. What had once been unthinkable became acceptable, then admirable. This transformation did not happen overnight. It unfolded gradually as laws changed, language hardened, and empathy narrowed. Each step seemed small, but together they led to mass persecution and genocide. This is one of the most chilling aspects of the story. Evil did not always appear as evil. It often arrived disguised as order, security, and national revival. Human nature played a central role in this transformation. Fear discouraged resistance. Ambition encouraged collaboration. Conformity offered safety. Many who did not believe fully in Nazi ideology still participated because participation felt safer than isolation. Silence became a form of survival, and silence allowed atrocities to grow unchecked. Hitler's regime depended not only on fanatics, but on ordinary people adapting to extraordinary circumstances. This uncomfortable truth forces a deeper reflection. Under enough pressure, how many would act differently? Hitler's ideology also exploited the human tendency to dehumanize those labeled as other. Once people are reduced to symbols, threats, or stereotypes, violence against them becomes psychologically easier. Language was critical in this process. Words like parasite, enemy, and degenerate stripped victims of individuality. When empathy is erased, conscience follows. The Holocaust did not begin with gas chambers. It began with words, laws, and social exclusion. This progression serves as a warning about how easily prejudice can escalate when reinforced by authority. The concentration of power in a single leader amplified these dangers. Hitler was not constrained by accountability, criticism, or moral limits. His personal obsessions became national policy. His paranoia became law. His refusal to admit error led to catastrophic decisions, including wars that destroyed Germany itself. Absolute power did not stabilize the nation, it accelerated its collapse. This illustrates a fundamental truth about leadership. Unchecked authority magnifies flaws rather than correcting them. When a leader equates personal will with national destiny, dissent becomes treason and failure becomes inevitable. Perhaps the most haunting lesson is how ordinary all of this felt at the time. Life continued. People went to work. Children went to school. Many believed that excesses would fade, that things would normalize. This gradual normalization of injustice is one of history's greatest dangers. When moral boundaries shift slowly, people adjust without realizing how far they have moved. By the time the full horror is visible, it feels too late to intervene. Hitler's Germany demonstrates how societies can slide into darkness, not through sudden collapse, but through incremental surrender. The global consequences of this surrender were immense. Tens of millions died, entire communities were erased, Europe was left in ruins, yet even after such devastation, the deeper lesson remains. Relevant. The conditions that enabled Hitler, economic despair, social division, political cynicism, and fear of the future, are not confined to one era. They reappear whenever people lose faith in institutions and seek salvation in individuals rather than principles. Hitler's rise warns against the seductive appeal of ideology that offers identity at the cost of humanity. It cautions against leaders who claim exclusive access to truth, who demand loyalty over law, and who frame compromise as weakness. It exposes how easily freedom can be exchanged for the illusion of security, and how quickly hatred can be justified when wrapped in the language of survival. In the end, the story is not only about a dictator, but about choice. Millions made small decisions, to cheer, to remain silent, to look away, that collectively shaped history. The lesson is not that such evil is inevitable, but that it becomes possible when vigilance fades. Power must be questioned. Language must be challenged. Institutions must be defended not only by law, but by courage. Hitler's rise leaves the world with a stark, enduring warning. When fear replaces reason, when ideology replaces empathy, and when power is placed above humanity, the consequences are not abstract. They are measured in lives lost, futures destroyed, and generations haunted by what happens when human nature's darkest impulses are allowed to rule unchecked.